Hello and welcome to our third and final session on the life and teachings of Martin Luther. Today we want to get a sketch of Martin's life from the time he was hidden away at Wartburg in 1521 to the time of his death in 1546. This is a lot of ground to cover, so there will be a lot of important events that will go unmentioned. Well, let's get started. Last time we left Luther, he was essentially in hiding after the Diet of Worms. And for about 10 months, Luther was kept at Wartburg Castle, assuming the alias of Knight George. This was a productive time for Luther. One of the most significant events was the translation of the Greek New Testament into German. Being holed up, Martin was always eager to hear news of events in Wittenberg. Events on the ground kept changing. Some of the changes taking place was the fact that a number of priests who identified with Luther's teaching began to question the need to remain bound to their monastic vows, especially their vows of celibacy. Early on, we begin to see that Luther's reforms have an immediate impact on the monasteries of Germany. Another important issue had to do with the Mass, especially how the Lord's Supper was to be celebrated. During the Middle Ages, officially dating back to the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, the celebration of the Mass was conducted in such a way that the priests would partake of both bread and wine, while congregants were only allowed to take the bread, so long as they didn't touch it themselves. In light of Luther's teachings, priests began to question this practice, and as a result, congregations began having the Lord's Supper with both bread and wine. Of course, anytime one introduces changes to long-established practices, there will always be significant pushback as well. Change was in the air, and Luther's stance against Rome at Worms had the effect of emboldening many to a more radical change. As news of further unrest reached Luther at Wartburg, it became increasingly more difficult for Martin to remain, and on Christmas Day in 1521, Luther returns to a very different Wittenberg than the one he had left a year ago. The disturbance in Wittenberg was furthered by the arrival of 3 men claiming to be prophets who spoke under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. Luther denounced these fanatics and demanded that they prove their claims with a miracle. Unable to offer up such proof, the Zwickau prophets turned and departed from Wittenberg, denouncing Luther as well. The radicalization going on at this time can be seen as a reactionary overreach. Such views were to spawn a new church tradition that we know as the Anabaptists. The Anabaptists denounced infant baptism, claimed special revelation, and often held to strong anti-imperial and almost anarchic political views. The Mennonite tradition has its roots in the radical movement at this time. Also, don't confuse the Anabaptists with Baptists. Baptists trace their roots to English Puritanism, and not the Anabaptists of Luther's day. One important person in all this is Andreas Karlstadt. Karlstadt was a senior colleague to Luther at the university who initially was a strong supporter of Luther. But Karlstadt was more sympathetic to the more radical visions of change in the church and had a significant falling out with Luther. When Luther returned, the way he went about settling things down and providing much needed order for the city was to return to the pulpit. But rather than teaching the free grace of justification, Luther hammered the people of Wittenberg with the law and the commands of Christ, to peace and good order, to simple tasks of loving your neighbor and doing good deeds to one another. Furthermore, Luther began to build a team of men around him who he could rely upon to set about the rebuilding of the church. 2 important men were Philip Melanchthon and John Bugenhagen. Melanchthon is a name we hear more often because he played such a pivotal role in writing important documents in the years to come. Bugenhagen was more of a personal accountability partner to Luther. Bugenhagen would be the person that Luther would go to confess his sins and receive the words of Christ's forgiveness. One theme that will take shape during this time that becomes a staple of Lutheran theology is the idea that Christ reigns over 2 kingdoms. The first kingdom is the kingdom of the Holy Spirit and in the soul of the believer. The second kingdom is Christ's institutional reign over the state and the institutional church. This doctrine of separate kingdoms provided freedom for the individual and a sense of limits for temporal authority. While Luther, Melanchthon, and Bugenhagen had their hands full in Wittenberg, much of Germany remained unstable, and revolution was in the air. We mentioned last week how the influence of the general public served as something of a check on imperial power at the Diet of Worms. The unrest of the general public continued, and it resulted in a grassroots rebellion among the peasant workers in Germany. Over the previous century, Central Europe experienced an overall population decline, due largely to poor crops and incidental plagues. This depopulation put a stress on local lords to maintain a stable income and a stable tithe to Rome. The result of this, in many cases, was an increase in rents upon the people. These demographic and economic factors, when added to the spirit of change seen in Luther's emboldened revolt, brought about this uprising. The German princes urged Luther to intervene on their behalf, and he did. One thing that is something of an irony in Luther's life is his role as a revolutionary on the one hand, and his deep animosity to any form of rebellion in others on the other hand. Luther writes a treatise called Against the Murderous and Thieving Hordes of the Peasants. Luther called upon the princes to be understanding and good to their peasants on the one hand, but on the other hand he called upon them to be ruthless in stamping out the uprising. He wrote, "It is just as when one must kill a mad dog. If you do not strike him, he will strike you and a whole land with you." Another controversy that occupied much of Luther's time during the 1520s was what is known as the sacramentarian controversy. The Reformation was moving beyond the borders of Germany, and it took root in Switzerland as well. However, a disagreement over the nature of the presence of the Lord's body and blood in the Eucharist proved to be a dividing issue among the Swiss reformers and Luther. Unlike Luther, the Swiss were more heavily influenced by Renaissance humanism and more taken by appeal to logic than Luther. For the Swiss, since Jesus ascended bodily into heaven, his body remained there, and it was not logical for his body and blood to be in two places at the same time. Luther wanted nothing to do with this sort of reasoning. For Luther, the Bible said, "This is my body," and that was good enough for him. The controversy reached a head at the Colloquy of Marburg in 1529. There, Martin Bucer, Johannes Oecolampadius, and Ulrich Zwingli met with Luther to try and reach an agreement. Luther would not budge and remained unpersuaded by their arguments. At one point, Luther scratched into the wooden table, "Hoc est meum corpus," "This is my body." The colloquy ended in a failure, and the Reformed and Lutherans have been divided ever since. It is interesting to note that Martin Bucer was later able to come to some agreement with Luther years later, but the damage had already been done. Also, John Calvin's sacramental writings show something of a mediating position between Luther and Zwingli, but Calvin later compromised his views with the Swiss in order to maintain union with the Reformed. 1525 was also the year that Martin Luther married Katie. Katharina von Bora was known as a handsome woman with a noble lineage, who was a Cistercian nun. In 1523, she and a number of nuns from their order escaped their nunnery in used beer and pickle barrels. They arrived at Luther's door, and Martin set about the task of finding these women husbands. Katrina turned down every offer made to her, until Martin himself finally stepped in and asked for Katie's hand. She said yes. Katie was a remarkable woman. She and Martin had 6 children, and she established a reputation for a firm and capable household management. Luther tended to be a spendthrift, and Katie was the only one able to keep him in check. They had a remarkable marriage, and they served as role models for the German people. Another important event was the debate between Luther and one Desiderius Erasmus over the issue of the freedom of the will. Erasmus was an intellectual giant in the 1500s, known mostly for his biblical scholarship. With a deep theological mind, Erasmus nevertheless esteemed simple piety over theological fine points. Erasmus, while sympathetic to much of Luther's teaching, remained a loyal Catholic his entire life. As the divide between Rome and Luther widened, Erasmus became more and more distant to Luther, who would often liken himself to Erasmus's little brother. Erasmus published a public attack on Luther entitled A Diatribe on the Freedom of the Will. Luther in turn responded with his now famous work on the bondage of the will. Erasmus was personally hurt by this work, and their long-standing friendship and mutual admiration with one another was forever undone. In 1526, an imperial diet was called for in the city of Speyer. At this diet, not attended by Luther, Emperor Charles V grants local princes permission to establish their own religious practices. The emperor would later go back on this, but in the meantime it granted Luther a little more security from his enemies. In the years 1526 and 1527, we also see Luther engaged in much pastoral work. One issue that concerned him was the overall state of theological and biblical knowledge among the local pastors. Luther set about an extensive course of visitation to many churches to inspect the quality of their teaching and their level of understanding of the gospel. In short, Luther was horrified with what he found. This would lead him to publish his large and small catechism for the express purpose of bringing a level of competence to both the German people and their pastors. In 1527, Luther found himself in ill health on a number of occasions, and it is also at this time that the plague hits Wittenberg. The Luther home became something of a makeshift hospital, and in the midst of his own struggles with health and uncertainty, Luther wrote the famous hymn, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," a meditation on Psalm 46. It was in the year 1529 that Luther's large and small catechism were formally published. This same year, the Second Diet of Speyer was called. At this diet, Charles V rescinded his earlier actions of religious freedoms to the princes. Those princes who were loyal to Luther protested this action and became known as the Protesting Estates, or Protestants. This is where we get the term Protestant. In 1530, Luther also returns to his teaching duties at the university and sets about to work on his famous commentary on Paul's epistle to the Galatians. In April of 1530, Charles V calls for another imperial diet. This diet was for the purpose of putting an end to the religious divisions within the empire once and for all. He called upon Luther and his colleagues to present a document expressing their teachings and allowed Johannes Eck and the supporters of Rome a chance to respond. The result was the Augsburg Confession. The confession was largely written by Melanchthon, but Luther gave it his full approval. A side note, at one point early in John Calvin's pastoral career, he personally signed his agreement to this confession as well. The diet was a failure, and with its failure, the threat of civil war loomed large. There would in fact be much war and bloodshed over the next decades between Lutherans and imperial forces. During the decades of the 1530s, Luther threw himself into bringing about further church reforms and order to church practices. The full edition of the German Bible was printed and immediately became a bestseller. In 1535, Luther gave his last lecture at the University of Wittenberg on the Book of Genesis. Also during this time, Luther lent his assistance to the political turmoil. He was a consistent voice of non-rebellion to the princes, sometimes to their great annoyance. During this decade, Zwingli was killed on the battlefields of Switzerland, and a young John Calvin published his first edition of a modest work called The Institutes of the Christian Religion. As Luther entered into old age during the 1540s, one more controversy became a part of his legacy. The Elector of Saxony had called for the removal of Jews within his province and asked Luther to assist in propagating these anti-Semitic laws. Luther wrote the treatise Against the Jews and Their Lies. In this work, Luther called upon the German people to strip Jews of both property and possession within their communities. He called upon the German people to round up those who refused to leave and use them for forced labor. These ideas of Luther were used to great effect by Adolf Hitler in the 1930s. There is really no way to give Luther a pass here. It's hard to reckon with the fact that someone who could so clearly see the necessity of God's grace was at the same time so blind and heartless with respect to the Jewish people. Perhaps the most important thing to learn from this is that no matter how much we might like to lionize our heroes of the past, they, like us, were sinful and in need of Christ's forgiveness. Finally, Luther preached his last sermon on February 14th, 1546, at Eisleben, Germany, the city of his birth. During his sermon, he was overcome with a weakness and had to cut his message short. 4 days later, on February 18th, Luther passed away, In his clothing was found a scrap of paper with the words, "We are all beggars," a fitting description of Luther's entire life. Well, this ends our course on Luther and his life and writings. For next time, I would like us to read the second part of the Small Catechism, dealing with baptism, confession, and the altar. Thanks for joining us in this conversation, and I hope it was helpful for you. We will see you on Sunday.